What happens when a war-scarred cowboy drags a dying mother from a blizzard, swears to steal her children back from a ruthless outlaw, and discovers the only way home is through the ghosts he's avoided for years? Will the rescue save her, or resurrect the part of him the winter buried? My name is Silas Blackwood, and what I'm about to tell you happened in a time when the world felt both vast and unforgivingly small. It was the winter of '83, a season so fierce it seemed the land itself had frozen solid, its heart no longer beating beneath the snow. The wind howled down from the granite peaks with a voice like a grieving mother, and the cold was a physical thing, a predator that stalked the edges of your fire and seeped through the thickest wool. We were 4 men pushing a small herd of half-starved cattle south, trying to outrun the worst of the weather. A fool's errand, but the pay was promised, and in those days a man did what he had to. My companions were a rough lot Hollis with a laugh like grinding stones, young Cale, who was more bravado than sense, and grizzled old Schmidt, who spoke only to his horse and the whiskey flask in his coat. They were men hardened by the frontier, their compassion worn down to a nub by the sheer effort of survival. I was no different, or so I thought. 29 years of life had taught me that mercy was a luxury, a warm meal you couldn't always count on. My own past was a quiet, frozen landscape, dominated by the memory of my younger brother Daniel, who'd walked out into a blizzard 7 years prior to track a lost calf, and had simply vanished. He was swallowed by the white, leaving behind nothing but a silence that echoed louder than any storm. That loss had carved something out of me, leaving a hollow space that the winter cold always seemed to find. We were riding through a stretch of desolate country where the pines stood like black skeletons against the bruised gray sky. The snow was deep, broken only by the trail we blazed. It was Cale who saw her first. What in God's name is that? He breathed, his voice a plume of white vapor. I followed his gaze. There, maybe 100 yards off our trail, was a figure. A woman stumbling through the snowdrifts, her movements jerky and unnatural. She wore a simple calico dress, a pathetic defense against the brutal cold, torn at the side and stained with a dark, horrifying crimson that seemed to bloom against the white. One hand was pressed tight to her abdomen, and even from that distance I could see the snow around her feet was pink with her blood. "Looks like trouble," Hollis grunted, pulling his horse to a halt. "Leave it be, Silas. Nothing to do with us." Schmidt just spat a stream of tobacco juice, his face a mask of indifference. "She's buzzard bait. Already dead and just don't know it yet." They saw a problem, an inconvenience. But I saw something else. I saw the desperate, mechanical way she kept moving, one foot in front of the other, as if pulled forward by a string of pure will. She wasn't crying out or waving for help. She was simply enduring, her entire being focused on the next agonizing step. It was the same stubborn refusal to surrender that I imagined Daniel must have felt right up until the end. The hollow space inside me ached. "She's been shot," I said, my voice low and hard. And Hollis shot back. "Could be Apaches about. Could be her own man did it. Either way, she's a magnet for whatever bad business is out here." He was right. Logic was on his side. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed to turn my horse and ride on, to forget the bloody specter in the snow. But I couldn't. I looked at her barefoot, her dark hair a tangled mess against the impossible pallor of her skin, and I saw the ghost of my brother. I saw every soul ever lost to the indifference of this land. Without another word, I swung my leg over my saddle. My boots hit the frozen ground with a solid crunch that seemed to echo in the profound silence. "Don't be a damn fool," Blackwood, Cale warned. "We've got cattle to move." I didn't look back at them. "You go on," I said, my voice flat. "I'll catch up, or I won't." I started walking towards her. The cold bit at my cheeks and the snow was deeper than I'd thought, clinging to my trousers. She didn't seem to notice me until I was just a few yards away. Her head came up, and her eyes, a startling pale blue wide with fever and shock, found mine. There was no plea in them, only a vast, desolate emptiness. Then, as if the last string holding her upright had snapped, her knees buckled and she pitched forward into the snow. I lunged, catching her before she was completely buried. She was shockingly light, a bundle of sharp bones and fragile heat. A soft hiss of pain escaped her lips as my arms went around her. Up close, I could see the situation was worse than I'd imagined. The wound in her side was a messy, dark ruin. Her skin was unnaturally hot to the touch, yet she shivered uncontrollably. "Easy now," I murmured, crouching and cradling her against my chest to shield her from the wind. "Easy. I've got you." Her eyes fluttered open again, They were hazed with delirium, but she focused on my face. Her lips were blue and cracked. Water, she whispered, the sound, a dry rustle of leaves. I fumbled with the canteen at my hip, my fingers clumsy with cold. I unscrewed the cap and gently lifted it to her mouth. She drank in desperate, trembling sips, her hand coming up to grip my wrist with a surprising strength. I could feel the frantic, thready pulse beneath her skin. When she'd had enough, her head fell back against my arm. "What's your name?" I asked, keeping my voice soft. She blinked slowly, as if the question had to travel a long way to reach her. "Nora," she breathed. "Eleanora Hale." I looked over my shoulder. Hollis, Cale, and Schmidt were still there, watching from the trail like vultures on a fence post. Hollis made a sharp gesture with his hand, a clear signal. "Let's go." Then he turned his horse, and the others followed, their dark shapes quickly receding into the gray landscape. They were leaving me. Leaving us. A bitter curse formed in my throat, but I swallowed it down. They didn't matter. All that mattered was the fading life in my arms. "Nora," I said, turning my attention back to her, "that's a nasty wound. I need to get you somewhere warm. Get you out of this wind." She gave a weak, almost imperceptible nod. Her eyes were closing again. I knew if I didn't act fast, the cold would finish what the bullet had started. I adjusted my grip, my mind racing. There was an old trapper's cabin about 2 miles east, tucked into a small canyon. I'd stumbled on it last spring. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot we had. "Hold on," I told her, though I wasn't sure she could hear me. "Just hold on." I lifted her into my arms. She weighed next to nothing, and the scent of blood and fever filled my senses. She moaned softly as I moved, a sound of pure agony that twisted something in my gut. My horse, a steady bay gelding named Oak, had followed me, and now stood patiently, his breath misting in the frigid air. With a grunt of effort, I managed to heave her into the saddle, then swung up behind her, pulling her back against my chest. I wrapped my arms around her, one hand holding the reins, the other pressed against her, trying to share what little warmth I had. As I nudged Oak into a walk, leaving the bloody snow and the lonely trail behind, I knew I had crossed a line. My simple life of just getting by was over. I was now tied to this dying woman, responsible for the flicker of life she had left. And as the first snowflakes of a coming storm began to drift down from the iron sky, I had no idea if I was carrying her toward salvation, or just a different, slower kind of death. The 2 miles to that cabin felt like 100. The wind picked up a steady, vicious force that drove the snow into our faces and stole our breath. Nora was a dead weight against me, occasionally trembling with a violent spasm of shivers or muttering words too faint to understand. I kept my head down, my world shrinking to the space between Oak's ears. The feeling of the woman in my arms and the desperate prayer that my memory of the cabin's location was accurate. Every tree looked the same. Every snow-covered rock formation was a potential landmark that dissolved into anonymous white. Doubt began to creep in, cold and sharp as an icicle in the heart. What if I'd missed it? What if it was buried in a drift? What if it had collapsed over the summer, just as I was starting to believe I'd doomed us both? I saw it, a dark smudge against the gray cliff face, a low-roofed shape, half swallowed by snow. The cabin. Relief washed over me so intensely my knees went weak. Dismounting was a clumsy, agonizing process. Nora's body was limp, and I nearly fell getting her down. I half carried, half dragged her to the door, my boots sinking to the shins and the snow piled against it. The door was frozen shut. I had to put her down, propping her against the log wall, and throw my shoulder against the weathered wood. It groaned in protest, then burst open with a crack, sending me stumbling into the frigid darkness within. The cabin was small, a single room that smelled of cold ash dust and mice. But it had 4 walls and a roof, and that made it a palace. I carried Nora inside and laid her gently on the crude rope bed in the corner, her body sinking into the lumpy, straw-filled mattress. Her breathing was shallow, a faint rasp in the profound quiet. My first priority was a fire. My hands were numb, shaking so badly I could barely strike a match. The tinder I'd gathered was damp. The first match sputtered and died. The second, my curses were harsh whispers in the gloom. Finally, on the third try, a tiny flame caught on a piece of birch bark. I nursed it, fed it slivers of wood, blew on it with the last of my breath, until it grew into a real life-giving fire in the stone hearth. As warmth began to bleed into the small space, I turned my attention to Nora. I lit a tallow lamp, and in its flickering golden light I finally got a good look at her wound. It was bad. The bullet had torn through her side, leaving a ragged entry wound. I didn't know if it was still inside her. I'm no doctor, but I'd seen enough gunshot wounds to know this was beyond my skill. All I could do was clean it and stop the bleeding. I melted snow in a rusty pot over the fire. With a strip torn from my own spare shirt, I began to clean the wound as gently as I could. She cried out in her delirium a thin, wretched sound and tried to push my hands away. I know it hurts, I soothed, holding her steady. I'm sorry, I have to. As I worked, she began to talk, her voice a fevered murmur. Names tumbled from her lips, lost in a torrent of fragmented memories. Thomas, don't you cry now. Mama's here, she whispered, her brow furrowed with pain. Clara, hold my hand. Hold on tight. Such a pretty locket. My hands froze. Thomas. Clara. Her children. My heart constricted. This wasn't just a woman lying here, it was a mother. The image of her fighting her way through the snow took on a new, desperate clarity. She wasn't just trying to save herself. They took them, she moaned, her eyes wide and unseeing, staring at the cabin's ceiling. The men. Jedediah. He took my babies. A cold dread colder than the wind outside settled over me. This was no random act of violence. It was an abduction. She'd fought back and they'd shot her, leaving her for dead. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. I finished bandaging her, packing the wound with clean cloth and binding it tightly. Her fever was raging. I spent the rest of that night and all through the next day bathing her face with cool water, forcing sips of broth between her lips and listening to her fever dreams. She spoke of a farm, of a cruel husband who died of lung fever the year before, of the crushing loneliness, and the two small lights of her life. Her 7-year-old daughter Clara, and her 5-year-old son Thomas, who walked with a slight limp from a fall he'd taken as a toddler. And she spoke of a man named Jedediah Kane, a man with a scarred face and eyes like chips of flint who had come to their farm with 2 others, taken their wagon, their food, and their children. Listening to her, I felt the ghost of my own loss stir. I knew what it was to have your world ripped apart, to be left with a hole that could never be filled. I remembered the weeks after Daniel disappeared, how my mother would stand at the window for hours watching the snow, as if her will alone could make him walk out of the trees. She wasted away, eaten from the inside out by a hope that was really just another form of grief. I would not let that happen to Nora. Sometime during the second night, her fever broke. I was dozing in the chair by the fire when a sound brought me awake. She was looking at me. Her eyes were clear for the first time, the delirium gone, replaced by a profound, soul-deep weariness. You stayed, she said, her voice a raw whisper. I stayed, I confirmed. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Why? It was the question I had been asking myself. Why hadn't I ridden on? Why was I here in a derelict cabin, in the middle of a blizzard, with a woman I didn't know and a trouble that was bigger than any I had ever faced? I looked at her pale, determined face, and the answer came to me, simple and stark. Because my mother waited for someone to bring my brother home, I said the words, feeling heavy and strange in the quiet room. No one ever did. I couldn't be the man who rides away. Something shifted in her gaze. It wasn't trust, not yet. It was something more fragile. Recognition. She looked at me and saw not a stranger but a fellow survivor. She held my gaze for a long moment. Then her eyes drifted towards the door, towards the howling emptiness outside. My children, she whispered, and her voice broke the sound of a heart shattering. He has my children. I know, I said softly, my voice rough with an emotion I couldn't name. And I swear to you, Nora Hale, we will get them back. It was a reckless promise made in the dead of a winter night by a man who had nothing to offer but his own stubborn will. But as I said it, I felt that hollow space inside me fill with a cold, hard purpose. The winter had taken my brother. I would not let it take her children too. The storm lasted for 3 days. 3 days of being sealed in that tiny cabin, the world outside a howling chaos of white. It was a strange, suspended time. I kept the fire roaring, melted snow for water, and shared the last of my dried venison and hardtack with Nora. She was weak. So weak she could barely sit up, but the clarity in her eyes remained. The fever was gone, but in its place was a pain that was sharper and deeper. We didn't talk much at first. The silence was filled with the shriek of the wind and the crackle of the fire. I watched her, saw the way she'd flinch at a sudden gust, her gaze darting to the door. Her hands would clench the thin blanket, her knuckles white. She was a bowstring pulled taut, ready to snap. On the second day she spoke. He told them I was dead, she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. She was staring into the fire, her profile etched by the flickering light. Jedediah. When he shot me, he looked down and said, "The wolves can have her. Tell the children their mama went to sleep in the snow." A cold fury unlike anything I'd ever known rose in my chest. It was a clean, pure rage. He was wrong, I said, my voice tight. She turned her head on the lumpy pillow to look at me. Was he? I feel dead, Silas. I feel hollowed out. You're not, I insisted, maybe more for my own sake than hers. You're a mother, and a mother's love doesn't die that easy. It's the toughest thing on God's green earth. She gave a small, bitter laugh that turned into a grimace of pain. My husband, Arthur, he used to say love was a weakness, a vulnerability. He was a hard man. The cold got into his soul long before it got into his lungs. She paused, her gaze distant. He wasn't kind to me. He wasn't kind to the children either. After he passed, I thought we were finally free. Free to have a quiet life. I was so foolish. You weren't foolish, I said, moving my chair closer to her cot. You were hopeful. There's no shame in that. There's no room for it either, she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. This land, it doesn't reward hope. It punishes it. I had no answer for that. She wasn't wrong. I thought of my mother's hope, how it had become a cage of her own making. We have to get to a town, I said, changing the subject. There's a ranch about a day's ride from here run by a woman named Agnes. She's a friend. She'll help us. Her husband was a doctor before he passed. She knows more about wounds than I do. A day's ride, she repeated, her voice laced with a desperate urgency. A whole day. They're getting farther away with every second that passes. You try to ride now. You'll tear that wound open and bleed out before we've gone a mile, I said firmly but gently. You're no good to your children, dead Nora. You need to heal. You need to be strong for when we find them. Her jaw tightened. I saw the fierce pride in her, a bedrock of strength beneath the layers of pain and fear. It was the same will that had driven her through the snow. She hated being helpless, hated relying on me, a stranger. I respected that. When the storm breaks we ride, she conceded, her voice regaining a sliver of its resolve. The storm broke on the fourth morning. The silence was deafening. I opened the cabin door to a world transformed. It was a pristine, brilliant landscape of white, the snow sculpted into fantastic shapes by the wind, the sky a piercing cloudless blue. The air was so cold it burned to breathe. Getting Nora onto Oak was even harder than the first time. She was conscious now, and every movement was agony. She bit her lip until it bled, but she didn't cry out. I mounted behind her again, her body rigid, with pain against my chest. The ride to Agnes's ranch was a slow, grueling ordeal. The sun on the snow was blinding. Oak struggled through massive drifts, his breath pluming, his muscles straining. I kept a low, constant murmur going, talking to Nora, telling her about the land, about Oak, about anything to keep her mind off the pain. I told her about Daniel, about how he'd been able to name every star in the sky and could mimic any bird call. Talking about him, I realized I hadn't spoken his name aloud to another soul in years. We arrived at the ranch just as the sun was setting, casting long blue shadows across the snow. It wasn't much, just a sturdy log house, a barn, and a few corrals, all nestled in a valley that offered some protection from the wind. A plume of smoke curled from the stone chimney. Agnes came out onto the porch as we approached. She was a stout woman in her late 50s, with a face mapped by hardship and a gaze that missed nothing. She took in the sight of us, me haggard and frost-nipped, and Nora barely conscious, slumped against me, and her expression didn't change. "Looks like you found some trouble, Silas," she said, her voice dry as dust. "Or it found you." "A bit of both," I replied, my voice cracking with exhaustion. "She's been shot, Agnes. Needs help." Agnes didn't waste time with questions. "Bring her in," she commanded, holding the door open. "Get her in the spare room. There's water on the stove." That night, Agnes took over. She was brusque and efficient, but her hands were surprisingly gentle. She cleaned and redressed Nora's wound with a skill that spoke of long practice, clucking her tongue at my clumsy bandage. She brewed a bitter-smelling tea that made Nora sleep a deep, healing sleep without dreams. I sat by the fire in Agnes's main room, the warmth seeping into my bones, feeling the exhaustion of the past 4 days settle over me like a lead blanket. Agnes came and sat opposite me, a mug of coffee in her hand. "You going to tell me what this is all about?" she asked, her sharp eyes studying my face. So I told her. I told her everything from finding Nora in the snow to the whispered names of her children and the man called Jedediah Kane. When I finished, Agnes was silent for a long time, staring into the flames. Jedediah Kane, she finally said, her voice low. I've heard that name. He's bad news, Silas. A snake. Used to run with a rough crowd up in the mining camps. Word is he's got debts all over the territory. He's got her children, I said. And you aim to get them back, she stated. It wasn't a question. I do. She took a long sip of her coffee. This ain't your fight. I made it my fight, I said, meeting her gaze. She held my look for a moment, then gave a slow nod. Your brother would be proud of you, she said softly. He was always the one to bring home strays. Her words hit me harder than any physical blow. I had to look away, my throat suddenly thick. Nora stayed at the ranch for a week. Under Agnes's care, she began to mend. The color returned to her cheeks. She started eating first broth, then solid food. She was quiet, but I could see the strength returning to her, coiling within her like a spring. Every day I'd see her at the window, staring east, her expression a mixture of fierce impatience and heart-wrenching sorrow. I spent my days doing chores around the ranch, repaying Agnes for her kindness, but my mind was on the trail. I spoke to a few riders passing through, asking quiet questions. On the 6th day, I got a lead. A fur trapper had seen a wagon matching Nora's description heading towards the old rail line at Winslow Pass. It was being driven by a man with a scarred face, and the trapper had heard children crying inside. My heart hammered in my chest. They were still alive. I brought the news to Nora that evening. She was sitting on the porch, wrapped in one of Agnes's thick wool blankets, watching the stars prick the vast black sky. Her head snapped up when I told her. The hope that flared in her eyes was so fierce it was almost painful to see. Winslow Pass, she breathed. How far? 2 days hard ride. Maybe 3 with the snow. We leave in the morning, she said, her voice devoid of any weakness. She started to stand, her movements still stiff. Nora, you're not well enough. Don't, she cut me off, her voice sharp as broken glass. She took a step towards me, her eyes blazing in the dim light from the house. Don't you dare tell me what I am or am not ready for. Those are my children. I am their mother. I have been lying in that bed useless for a week while he takes them farther and farther away. I will not be left behind. I will ride or I will walk. But I am going, Silas. With or without you. I looked at her, at this woman who had been shot and left for dead, who had faced down a blizzard and her own mortality, and I saw a force of nature that would not be denied. There was no arguing with her. There was no protecting her from this. All I could do was stand by her side. All right, Nora, I said, my voice quiet. We go together. A flicker of surprise, then gratitude softened her expression. She gave a single sharp nod. We left before dawn under a sky the color of slate. Agnes had packed us supplies, food, blankets, and a small pouch of herbal remedies. She pressed a heavy Colt pistol into Nora's hand. You know how to use this? Agnes asked. My father taught me, Nora replied, her grip firm and steady. He said a woman's best friend is a well-aimed bullet. As we mounted up, me on Oak and Nora on a calm, steady mare Agnes had loaned us. Agnes put a hand on my arm. You bring her back, Silas, she said. And you bring back those children. I will, I promised. As we rode out, the rising sun set the snow-covered peaks on fire. The world was beautiful and deadly, and we were 2 small figures moving across its frozen heart, chasing a shadow. I rode beside her, watching the determined set of her jaw, and felt a profound shift within me. This was no longer just about my past, about my brother. It was about her future. It was about the family this unforgiving land had tried to erase, and the promise I had made to help put them back together. The cold winter air filled my lungs, and for the first time in a long time it didn't feel empty. It felt like a beginning. The ride to Winslow Pass was a silent, grinding battle against the cold and the land itself. Nora rode with a ramrod straight posture that I knew must be causing her agony, but her face was a stoic mask. She was saving all her energy, all her will for the task ahead. We traveled for hours without speaking, the only sounds: the rhythmic crunch of hooves on snow, the creak of saddle leather, and the whisper of the wind through the skeletal branches of aspens. That night we made a cold camp in the lee of a granite outcropping. The fire was small, just enough to boil coffee and thaw our frozen limbs. As we sat huddled in our blankets, the vast star-dusted sky felt like a cold, indifferent ceiling. Tell me about them, I said, breaking the silence. Clara and Thomas. Nora was quiet for a moment, her gaze lost in the flames. When she spoke, her voice was soft, heavy with memory. Clara. She has my mother's eyes. She's serious. She feels everything so deeply. She loves to draw. She'll find a piece of charcoal and draw little flowers and birds on any scrap of wood she can find. A faint, sad smile touched her lips. Thomas, he is pure light. He was born smiling, I think. He's never met a stranger. He collects stones. His pockets are always full of them smooth gray stones from the creek bed. He says they're dragon eggs. She fell silent, and I felt the weight of her grief fill the small space between us. I was no longer just chasing a villain. I was fighting to restore a world of charcoal flowers and dragon eggs. What about your brother? She asked, her voice gentle. Daniel. It was my turn to stare into the fire. He was younger than me by 2 years. Thinner. Smarter too. He read books when he could get them. He wanted to be a teacher. He wasn't built for this life, not really. Too gentle. But he was stubborn. That day, the snow was already coming down hard. I told him to let the calf go. It wasn't worth it. He just looked at me with those steady eyes of his and said, "Everything's worth something, Silas." I swallowed the memory, a hard lump in my throat. Those were the last words he ever said to me. You blame yourself, she stated, her perception cutting straight to the bone. Every day, I admitted. If I'd been more forceful, if I'd gone with him. Or maybe you'd both be gone, she countered softly. Sometimes, Silas, there's no right choice. There's only the choice you make, and the one you have to live with. Her words didn't absolve me, but they loosened a knot inside me I hadn't realized was there. We sat in a shared, quiet understanding, two people defined by what they had lost, hoping to find something in the frozen wastes ahead. The next day we found a sign. A small carved wooden bird no bigger than my thumb lying half buried in the snow near a frozen creek. Nora saw it. She slid from her horse with a sharp intake of breath and snatched it up. It's Clara's, she whispered, her fingers closing around it possessively. She carries it everywhere. She must have dropped it. Her eyes scanned the trail ahead, a renewed, almost feral intensity in her gaze. They came this way. We're close. The discovery spurred us on. We rode harder, stopping only for the briefest rests. Late that afternoon, as the light began to fail, we crested a ridge, and I saw it below us, a thin tendril of smoke rising from a dense patch of pines in a narrow canyon. A camp. My heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I pulled Oak to a halt and put a hand on Nora's arm. She was already staring down at the smoke, her body vibrating with tension. We wait for dark, I said, my voice a low command. We go in on foot. She nodded, her eyes never leaving the smoke. She didn't have to voice the question that hung between us. What if it's not them? The waiting was the hardest part. As dusk bled across the snow, turning it from blue to purple to black, we tethered the horses and made our way down the ridge on foot. We moved like ghosts, using the rocks and trees for cover. The cold was absolute, and every snap of a twig underfoot sounded like a gunshot. As we got closer, we could hear voices. The rough laughter of men, then another sound, a child's cry, quickly shushed. Nora stiffened beside me, and I felt a wave of pure, unadulterated hatred wash through me. It was them. We crawled to the edge of the clearing. There were 3 men, just as she'd said. 2 were huddled by a sputtering fire. The third, a big man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, was pacing near a canvas-covered lean, built against the side of the wagon. Jedediah Kane. He looked every bit the snake Agnes had described. I peered at the lean-to. Through a gap in the canvas, I could see 2 small shapes huddled together under a filthy blanket. My gaze met Nora's in the darkness, and I saw her anguish, her rage, her love, all of it burning in her eyes. I held up a hand, signaling patience, though every fiber of my being wanted to charge in. I'll draw their attention, I whispered, my mouth close to her ear. The 2 by the fire. You go for the children. Don't hesitate, Nora. Get them and run for the horses. Don't look back. What about you? She breathed. I'll handle Kane. Just go. I pressed my rifle into her hands. You might need this more. I have my pistol. She looked at the rifle, then back at me, her resolve hardening. I circled the camp, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. I found a spot with a clear line of sight and took a deep breath, the frigid air searing my lungs. Then I fired a single shot into the snow a few feet from the fire. Chaos erupted. The 2 men jumped up, cursing and grabbing for their guns. Who's out there? One of them yelled into the darkness. It was the diversion I needed. I saw a shadow detach itself from the edge of the clearing. Nora. She moved with a speed and silence I wouldn't have thought possible, a wraith intent on one thing. I fired again, this time kicking up snow closer to the men, forcing them to take cover behind a log. But Cain was smarter. He didn't look towards my shots. He looked towards the wagon, towards the lean-to. His eyes narrowed as he saw the flicker of movement. The woman, he snarled and started for the lean-to just as Nora reached it. My blood ran cold. "Cain," I shouted, stepping out from behind the rock. "Your business is with me." He stopped, turning to face me. A cruel smile twisted his scarred face in the firelight. "Blackwood, heard you were dogging my trail. Should have left well enough alone." He was fast. His pistol was out of its holster in a blur. A shot rang out and I felt a searing pain in my left shoulder as I dived for cover. I hit the ground hard, the impact jarring my teeth. I rolled, bringing my own pistol up, but as I did, a scream tore through the night. It was Nora. One of the other men had circled around and grabbed her from behind. "Drop it, Blackwood," Cain ordered, his grin widening. "Or the mother gets it before the brats." Everything stopped. The wind, the fire, my own heart. I was trapped. I could see Nora struggling, her face a mask of fury. The man holding her laughed a nasty, brutish sound. And then from inside the lean-to, a small voice cried out, "Mama." Something inside Nora broke. With a wild, guttural cry, she drove her head back into the face of the man holding her. There was a sickening crunch of bone, and he staggered back, howling in pain, his hands flying to his shattered nose. In that same motion, Nora spun the heavy rifle she still clutched, coming around like a club, and slammed the stock into his jaw. He dropped like a stone. Cain stared for a split second, momentarily stunned by her ferocity. It was the only opening I would get. Ignoring the fire in my shoulder, I aimed and fired. The shot caught Cain in the leg. He roared in pain and surprise, his leg buckling beneath him. The third man, seeing his partners down, made a run for the trees. I let him go. I scrambled to my feet, my pistol still trained on Cain, who was writhing on the ground. But my attention was on the lean-to. Nora had already ripped the canvas aside. She was on her knees, her arms wrapped around her two children, pulling them into an embrace so tight it seemed she was trying to merge them back into her own body. Sobs racked her frame, sounds of such profound relief and love that it made my own throat ache. A little girl with dark hair and a pale, serious face clung to her neck, while a small, limping boy buried his face in her side. I stood there watching the scene, the throbbing in my shoulder a distant thing. I saw the charcoal flowers and the dragon eggs, the whole world that had been stolen now restored in a desperate, clinging embrace in the firelight. The hollow space inside me, the one left by Daniel, was filled with the warmth of their reunion. It didn't fix my past, but it gave me a glimpse of a future I hadn't known was possible. I walked over to the groaning Jedediah Cain and kicked his pistol away into the snow. "You were wrong," I said, my voice low and shaking with the aftermath of the fight. The wolves didn't get her. His pain-filled eyes glared up at me with pure venom. I felt nothing but contempt. I turned my back on him and walked towards the fire, towards the sound of a mother whispering her children's names like a prayer. The fight was over. The long journey home was about to begin. We left them there, tied securely to the wagon wheel. I took their guns and left them enough food and water to last until someone stumbled upon them, which was more mercy than they deserved. My shoulder was a throbbing mess, but Nora, using the last of Agnes's supplies and a strip of her own dress, cleaned and bound it tightly. Her touch was gentle, her expression a mixture of concern and a new steely resolve I hadn't seen before. The woman who had stumbled through the snow was gone. In her place was a survivor. The children were quiet, their eyes huge in their small, pinched faces. They were scared, but being with their mother was a balm that was slowly working its magic. Thomas, the little boy, wouldn't let go of her hand. Clara, the girl, clung to Nora's mare, occasionally looking back at me with a solemn, appraising gaze. I was the stranger who had brought their mother back from the dead. I didn't know what to make of that, and neither did she. The ride back to Agnes's ranch was slower, quieter. We were no longer just two people, but the fragile beginnings of a family. I found myself watching them, the way Nora would lean down to whisper something to Thomas, or how Clara would point out a hawk circling overhead. These small, simple moments felt monumental. We camped one night on the trail, the four of us huddled around a fire that felt warmer than any I'd sat by before. I had carved a small, rough horse out of a piece of pine for Thomas. When I gave it to him, his eyes went wide. He took it with a reverence that was almost comical, then turned and solemnly handed me a smooth gray stone from his pocket. "It's a dragon's egg," he whispered. "For being brave." I closed my hand around the cool stone, my throat too thick to speak. I looked over the fire at Nora. She was watching us, and for the first time I saw a true unburdened smile on her face. It transformed her. It was like seeing the sun break through after a long, hard winter. In that moment, something shifted between us. It was no longer about a promise made to a stranger. It was about this small circle of warmth in the vast, cold darkness. When we arrived back at the ranch, Agnes took one look at my shoulder at the children clinging to Nora and simply nodded. "Get inside," she said, her voice gruffer than usual to hide her relief. "There's stew on the stove." We stayed with Agnes for another 2 weeks, while my shoulder healed and the children regained their strength. It was a time of quiet healing. The nightmares that had plagued Nora began to fade. The haunted look in the children's eyes was replaced by the natural curiosity of youth. Thomas's pockets once again filled with stones, and Clara found a piece of charcoal and began to draw on the floorboards of the porch. I knew a choice was coming. We couldn't stay with Agnes forever. Nora had nothing to go back to. Jedediah had burned her farm to the ground before he left. I had nothing but my horse and the clothes on my back. We were adrift. One evening I found Nora on the porch, watching the sunset paint the snowy peaks in shades of rose and gold. The children were asleep inside. "I have a little money saved," I said, standing beside her. "Not much, but maybe enough to get a start somewhere. A small plot of land, maybe. Down south where the winters aren't so mean." She turned to look at me, her expression unreadable in the fading light. "You don't owe us anything more, Silas. You gave me back my life. You gave me back my children. That's a debt that can never be repaid." "This isn't about debt," I said, my voice quiet but firm. I took a breath, the words I hadn't known I wanted to say rising to the surface. "Nora, when I found you, I was just as lost as you were. Just in a different way. That hollow place inside me, it's not so cold anymore." I looked at her pale blue eyes that had seen so much sorrow but still held so much strength. "I don't want to ride away. I want to stay. If you'll have me." She was silent for a long time, her gaze searching my face. I could see the fear there, the hesitation to trust again, to hope again. But I also saw something else, something that mirrored the feeling growing in my own heart. "My life has never been my own," she said softly. "It was my father's, then my husband's. I want to choose my life now, Silas. I want to build something that can't be burned down or stolen." She took a step closer, her hand finding mine in the twilight. Her fingers were warm. "I choose this. I choose you." We were married a month later by a traveling preacher right there in Agnes's front room. It was a simple affair. Agnes stood as our witness. Clara held a small bouquet of dried winter flowers she'd gathered. Thomas stood beside me, the carved horse clutched in one hand and my dragon's egg in the other. When the preacher said I could kiss the bride, I looked at Nora, at the woman I had carried out of the snow, and I felt a sense of peace settle over me, profound and absolute. This was home. We did move south. We found a small, neglected homestead in a valley where a creek ran year-round and the winters were mild. It was hard work rebuilding the cabin, clearing the fields. But we did it together. I taught Thomas how to whittle and he showed me the best places to find dragon eggs. Clara filled a sketchbook with drawings of her new home. And Nora bloomed. She laughed freely, a sound as beautiful as the creek water. She planted a garden and ran our home with a quiet strength that was the bedrock of our new life. Some nights after the children are asleep, we sit on the porch we built together. She'll lean her head against my shoulder and I'll put my arm around her and we'll watch the stars come out. The past is never truly gone. I still think about Daniel and she still has scars, both seen and unseen. But the ghosts are quieter now. The silence they left behind has been filled with the sounds of a family, with the warmth of a life chosen and built by hand. The winter of '83 was the harshest of my life. It was a season of death, of loss, and of brutal cold. But it was also the winter that brought me Nora. It was the winter I stopped running from the ghosts of my past and found a reason to build a future. It was the winter I learned that sometimes the greatest mercy isn't found in warmth, but in the willingness. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.